The factory woke before the sun, long before most of the city remembered it existed, and by the time the first pale light crept through the high, dust-coated windows, the machines were already humming, belts spinning, pistons rising and falling in a rhythm so familiar it felt like breathing. The air inside carried the heavy scent of oil, metal shavings, and heat that never fully left, even in winter, and men and women moved through it with practiced efficiency, steel-toed boots striking concrete in sync with the clatter of production. On the far side of the floor, where the older machines lived, where repairs were less glamorous and more dangerous, the black mechanic arrived quietly, as he always did, setting his lunch pail down beside a locker whose paint had long since chipped away. He did not rush, he never did, not because he was lazy, not because he lacked urgency, but because years on factory floors had taught him a truth speed could not replace. Machines remembered mistakes longer than people did. He checked the maintenance log before touching anything, running his fingers over handwritten notes left by younger techs who had come and gone, some careful, some sloppy, all of them convinced the plant would keep running no matter what corners they cut. He read everything twice, not out of fear, but out of respect for what could happen if something small went unnoticed. And when he finally approached the first press of the day, he rested a hand on the cold steel casing, as if listening to it, feeling vibrations others ignored. Around him, supervisors walked briskly with clipboards and tablets, eyes on output numbers scrolling upward, voices sharp with the pressure of deadlines and quotas that never seemed satisfied. And more than once, someone glanced his way with the same unspoken thought they had carried for months: he takes too long. No one ever said it directly at first. It came wrapped in comments that sounded harmless enough, jokes about him double-checking again, remarks about how the new guys could service 2 machines in the time it took him to finish one. He heard it all, absorbed it without reaction, because he had learned early in his career that arguing rarely changed minds already made up. He focused instead on his work, tightening bolts by feel rather than force, replacing parts that looked fine to anyone moving fast, parts that would have failed under stress, under heat, under the weight of a full production run. He had seen factories shut down for weeks over things dismissed as insignificant, had watched ambulances roll in after explosions that management insisted were unforeseeable, and those memories sat quietly behind his eyes every time someone told him to hurry. That morning felt no different on the surface, just another shift in a building that had seen decades of labor pass through it, but there was something in the air he could not quite place, a subtle change in the way one of the older conveyor systems vibrated when it kicked on, a faint, uneven whine beneath the usual roar. He paused longer than usual, crouching to inspect the housing unit most people ignored because it had never caused a problem before. And when he tapped it lightly with a wrench, the sound that came back was wrong, hollow, in a way metal should never be. He made a note in the log, circled it, and flagged the machine for deeper inspection later, knowing full well that later was a word management hated. Across the floor, a supervisor noticed him kneeling there and frowned, glancing at his watch before walking over, impatience already sharpening his tone. "You still on that one?" the supervisor asked, not hiding the annoyance. The mechanic looked up calmly, wiped his hands on a rag, and nodded. "Something's off," he replied. "Needs a closer look before we run it at full speed." The supervisor exhaled through his nose, the sound halfway between a sigh and a scoff. "We've got orders backed up," he said. "We can't babysit every machine." The mechanic met his eyes briefly, steady and unflinching. "It's not babysitting," he said quietly. "It's preventing something worse." The supervisor shook his head, already turning away. "Just don't fall behind," he called over his shoulder, leaving the unspoken message hanging in the air like a warning. By mid-morning, whispers moved faster than the conveyor belts, small comments exchanged near the break room, glances thrown his way when supervisors thought he wasn't looking. Too slow, too cautious, not a team player. The words were never written down, never formalized, but they followed him from station to station, and though he had carried heavier things in his life, the weight of being misunderstood never got lighter. He finished his tasks methodically, logged his findings clearly, and took his break alone, sitting on an overturned crate near the loading bay, listening to the echo of machines. Inside, while trucks idled outside, unaware of how close everything always was to going wrong. When the call came for an unexpected meeting just before lunch, he knew what it was before he even stood up. He wiped his hands, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the office area with the same measured pace he brought to every repair, passing co-workers who avoided his eyes, not out of cruelty, but out of the quiet relief that it wasn't them being called in today. The glass-walled office overlooked the factory floor, offering a perfect view of productivity in motion. And as he stepped inside, the hum of machines muffled by thick glass, he felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came when decisions were made without him. They sat him down across from a table cluttered with charts and performance metrics, numbers highlighted and circled, evidence presented without context, and when the plant manager finally spoke, the words came out rehearsed, polished, and final. "We need people who can keep up," the manager said, tapping a chart. "Your numbers just aren't where they should be." The mechanic listened without interruption, hands folded, posture calm, and when he was given a chance to respond, he chose his words carefully. "I work slow because I work safe," he said. "Those machines won't forgive shortcuts." There was an awkward silence, followed by the soft click of a pen being set down. "That's not what we're looking for anymore," the manager replied, and in that moment, the decision was sealed. He gathered his things a short while later, walking back through the factory floor as machines continued their relentless rhythm, indifferent to the change unfolding beside them. No one stopped him. No one thanked him. A few nodded quietly, respect mixed with fear, and as he stepped outside into the harsh midday light, the noise of the factory closing behind him, he took one last look at the building that had consumed years of his life. He did not know yet that the warning he'd left behind would soon come screaming back, louder than any machine. But as he walked away, lunch pail in hand, labeled too slow by people who measured value in output alone, the factory kept running, unaware that it had just fired the one person who knew how close it was to disaster. What no one seemed to understand about him was that he had built his entire career on fixing the things other people didn't even notice, the small irregularities that never showed up on a spreadsheet but always showed up later in the form of breakdowns, injuries, or shutdowns that cost far more than a few minutes of caution ever could. Long before he ever stepped foot in this factory, he had learned the hard way that machines were honest in a way people rarely were, because they always told you what was wrong. If you listened carefully enough, if you paid attention to sounds that were half a beat off, vibrations that traveled through steel when they shouldn't, heat that lingered where it wasn't meant to. Speed, in his mind, was useful only when it followed understanding, and too many mechanics were being taught to move fast before they knew what they were touching. He'd grown up watching his uncle work maintenance at a smaller plant across town, a place with fewer safety rails and more improvisation, and he'd seen what happened when warnings were brushed aside because production couldn't wait. He remembered the night a pressure valve failed, remembered the blast of steam that filled the bay, the way grown men ran without thinking, and the look on his uncle's face afterward, not fear, but guilt, because he had noticed the valve days earlier and been told to keep it moving. That lesson stayed with him, shaping the way he approached every job afterward, the way he treated each piece of equipment like it had the potential to hurt someone if disrespected. By the time he earned his certifications, he already knew that the most dangerous thing in any factory wasn't a broken machine. It was confidence backed by ignorance. At this plant, his reputation had formed quietly at first. When something went wrong on second shift or during the overnight run, when alarms tripped and no one could figure out why, someone eventually suggested calling him in, and more often than not, he found the issue in places no one else had checked. A cracked mount hidden behind a housing panel, a worn bearing masked by lubrication, a sensor misaligned by fractions of an inch. He fixed problems before they made noise, before they shut anything down, and because of that, his work rarely looked impressive in the moment. There were no dramatic saves, no visible heroics, just machines that kept running without incident, which management quietly came to expect as normal rather than extraordinary. Over time, that expectation turned into impatience. New supervisors arrived with fresh ideas and sharper timelines, armed with metrics that measured output, but not prevention, and his careful approach began to stand out in the worst way. While others swapped parts quickly and moved on, he stayed behind, checking tolerances, testing systems under load, documenting conditions that might not fail today, but would fail eventually. He tried to explain more than once why rushing certain procedures was risky, tried to point out patterns he'd seen across years and factories, but his warnings often landed flat, dismissed as old-school thinking in a workplace obsessed with efficiency. They didn't see that his slowness was deliberate, that it was built on foresight rather than hesitation. The problem was that foresight never looked urgent until it was too late. Management saw him spending extra minutes on machines that weren't technically broken yet, and they saw lost productivity rather than potential disaster avoided. Younger mechanics watched him work and assumed he was being overly cautious, unaware that the reason their shifts stayed uneventful was often because he had quietly prevented something from going wrong days earlier. When numbers dipped or deadlines loomed, his name surfaced in conversations about bottlenecks, about people who couldn't keep up, and the label stuck because it fit the narrative they needed. Even that last morning, when he flagged the conveyor housing, he knew exactly how it would be received. He had seen that pattern before too, minor anomaly, no immediate failure, easy to ignore. But what concerned him wasn't the present condition, it was what would happen under sustained load, when heat expanded metal and vibrations amplified stress fractures, when a part that seemed stable at low speed became unpredictable at full capacity. He had seen that exact scenario cascade into catastrophic failure at another plant years earlier. And the memory of it tightened his chest now. As he replayed the moment, management walked him out instead of listening. As he drove away from the factory, the noise of production fading behind him, his thoughts weren't on the insult of being fired or the uncertainty ahead. They were on the machines still running inside that building, the ones he had worked on for years, the one he'd flagged just hours earlier. He knew how thin the margin was between normal operation and chaos. knew that shortcuts always came due eventually. And as traffic carried him farther from the plant, a quiet dread settled in, not for himself, but for the people still on that floor, trusting systems that had just lost the one person who took the time to truly understand them. The meeting that ended his job was over in less than 10 minutes, yet it replayed in his mind with a clarity that made it feel much longer. Every word weighed down by the knowledge that the decision had been made long before he was invited into the room. He sat across from managers who avoided his eyes, their attention fixed on charts and screens that reduced years of experience to lines and percentages, and as they spoke, he recognized the language immediately. Not direct hostility, not open disrespect, but the polished tone of inevitability, the kind that framed dismissal as a business necessity rather than a choice. Phrases like operational efficiency and meeting targets floated between them, empty of context, disconnected from the human cost behind them, and he listened without interruption because he understood that once those words were used, there was no room left for conversation. When they cited his pace as the primary concern, he nodded slowly, acknowledging the accusation without conceding its meaning. And when one supervisor leaned forward to say, "We just need people who can move faster," he felt a familiar mix of frustration and restraint rise within him. He wanted to explain again that speed without understanding was reckless, that the very machines they praised for running smoothly had done so because he refused to rush them. But he also knew that repeating himself would not change anything now. Instead, he spoke plainly, his voice calm but firm, and said, "I don't rush things that can hurt people." And the silence that followed told him everything he needed to know about how little that mattered in the room. They handed him paperwork already prepared, termination forms dated and signed, evidence that this meeting was merely a formality. And as he skimmed the pages, his eyes caught phrases that stung more than outright criticism ever could: failure to meet performance expectations, inability to adapt, words that erase nuance and intention with bureaucratic ease. He signed where indicated, not because he agreed, but because refusing would not restore what had already been taken. And as he slid the papers back across the table, he felt the weight of years settle in his chest, not as bitterness, but as a quiet mourning for work he had taken pride in, and people he had tried to protect without recognition. Walking back through the factory floor afterward felt surreal. The noise unchanged, the machines indifferent to his departure, and he noticed details he had never paid attention to before: the way belts strained on the load, the slight misalignment in a press he'd planned to adjust later that week, the heat pooling near a junction box that should have been cooler. He wanted to stop, to fix them one last time, to leave the place safer than he'd found it, but he knew that stepping in now would only reinforce the narrative that he was the problem that he couldn't let go. So he kept moving, lunch pail in hand, boots echoing against concrete, his presence already beginning to fade from the rhythm of the floor. A few co-workers watched him pass, expressions caught between sympathy and fear, and one younger mechanic opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again, glancing toward the supervisor's office before looking away. He didn't blame them. Speaking up had consequences in places like this, and everyone learned sooner or later how quickly you could become expendable. When he reached his locker, he took his time, clearing it out, not out of defiance, but out of habit, folding his jacket neatly, wiping down tools he'd paid for himself, leaving the space clean as he always did, because dignity, he believed, was something you carried even when it wasn't returned. As he stepped outside, the door closing behind him with a final hiss. The midday sun felt harsher than it should have, and he paused for a moment in the parking lot, breathing deeply, grounding himself before getting into his truck. He did not shout, he did not curse. He simply sat there, hands resting on the steering wheel, thinking about the conveyor housing he'd flagged, about the hollow sound it made when tapped, about how long it might take before someone else noticed, if they noticed at all. The thought followed him as he drove away, heavier than the insult of being called too slow, because he knew that in factories like this, speed was celebrated until it failed, and when it did, the consequences would not be measured in lost minutes or missed quotas, but in damaged equipment and lives changed forever. And somewhere deep down, he feared that the meeting which ended his job had also set something else in motion, something no spreadsheet could predict. What too slow really meant had nothing to do with his hands or his mind, and everything to do with the system that had learned to value movement over meaning, output over outcome, and he had seen that pattern repeat itself long before this factory ever put his name on a schedule. He had been trained by people who believed that every machine carried a memory, that metal fatigued, seals weakened, and stress fractures formed quietly long before alarms ever sounded. And those lessons had shaped him into the kind of mechanic who paused where others passed by, who questioned good enough when the cost of being wrong was measured in injuries rather than delays. Speed, as management defined it, meant finishing a task and moving on. But speed, as he understood it, meant knowing when not to move at all, when to stop and listen, because something beneath the surface was asking for attention. He learned that philosophy early, after witnessing an accident at a previous plant where a press failed under load, sending shards of metal across the floor like shrapnel, injuring two workers who had trusted that routine inspections were enough. In the aftermath, investigations revealed that the warning signs had been there for weeks. Hairline cracks dismissed as cosmetic, vibrations blamed on normal wear, and the phrase, "we didn't think it was urgent," repeated so often it began to sound rehearsed. He had stood in that factory after the incident, watching blood being cleaned from concrete, listening to managers promise change, and he had promised himself then that if he ever saw the same signs again, he would slow down, no matter who told him to hurry. That promise followed him into every job afterward, shaping the way he approached maintenance, not as a race, but as a responsibility. At this factory, his caution often put him at odds with supervisors who had never worked a floor long enough to understand its dangers, people whose success was measured in charts rather than consequences. When they pushed for faster turnarounds, he pushed back with facts, with examples drawn from experience. But over time, resistance was labeled negativity, questions were framed as excuses, and his insistence on safety was recast as inefficiency. "We've always done it this way," became the default answer to his concerns, a phrase that comforted those in charge while ignoring the reality that this way had nearly failed before. The conveyor system he flagged on his last shift was a perfect example of what too slow really meant. On the surface, it ran fine, belts moving smoothly, sensors responding as expected. But beneath that normal operation, stress had begun to accumulate in places no quick inspection would catch. Heat had warped a housing just enough to misalign internal components, creating friction that would intensify under sustained load. And the hollow sound he'd heard when tapping it was the telltale sign of metal thinning where it shouldn't. To someone focused on output, it was invisible, but to him, It was a warning written in a language he'd spent decades learning to read. He had documented the issue carefully, knowing that written records were his only defense when concerns were dismissed, and he had planned to return to it later that day for a deeper inspection, possibly recommending a temporary shutdown for repairs, a suggestion he knew would not be welcomed. Management hated stoppages, even brief ones, because every minute offline translated into lost revenue, and too often they gambled that the system would hold together just long enough to meet targets. He had seen that gamble pay off before, reinforcing dangerous habits. But he had also seen it fail catastrophically, and those failures were what haunted him now as he drove away from the plant, wondering whether anyone would read his notes or simply clear the warning and keep production moving. To them, too slow meant he didn't fit the tempo they demanded, that he interrupted the illusion of control with inconvenient truths, and that made him expendable in a culture that rewarded speed until something broke. To him, too slow meant he took the time to think, to anticipate, to act before disaster forced everyone's hand. And as the factory continued running without him, machines straining under loads they were never meant to carry unchecked, he knew that time would soon reveal which definition mattered more. The warning no one heard had been sitting in plain sight long before the meeting, long before the paperwork, long before his name was quietly removed from the schedule, and as he drove farther from the factory, that knowledge pressed heavier than the box of tools in the back of his truck. He replayed the moment again and again, the way the wrench had echoed hollow against the conveyor housing, the way the vibration traveled unevenly through the steel, a subtle stutter that didn't belong in a system designed to move with precision. He had learned to trust those signals the way other people trusted gauges and alarms, because by the time a warning light flashed, it was often already too late. He had considered pushing harder that morning, had weighed the cost of insisting on a shutdown against the certainty of being labeled difficult, and in the end, he had done what the system allowed him to do. He documented the issue, flagged it clearly, and trusted that someone with authority would take it seriously. That trust felt naive now. He knew how those notes were usually treated, skimmed if at all, dismissed as caution bordering on paranoia, and as traffic carried him farther from the plant, a knot formed in his stomach, not fear for his job, but fear for the people still inside. The warning wasn't dramatic enough to force attention. There was no smoke, no sparks, no immediate failure. Just the quiet accumulation of stress that would continue to build as production ramped up through the afternoon. Inside the factory, his notes sat in the maintenance log, circled and initialed, a small interruption in a page full of routine checks and quick fixes, and as supervisors moved through the floor, eyes on numbers rather than machinery, the flagged conveyor was brought up only briefly, dismissed with a glance and a shrug. It was running after all. It always had. Someone joked that he'd been seeing ghosts lately, another example of how his caution had slowed things down, and the note was marked monitor, a word vague, enough to mean nothing at all. The line kept moving, speed increased to make up for perceived lost time, and the system responded the way overworked systems always do, by hiding its strain until it could no longer be ignored. By early afternoon, heat began to build around the housing he had flagged, friction increasing as components shifted further out of alignment, and operators noticed a slight change in sound, a faint grinding beneath the usual roar, but with quotas looming and supervisors watching. No one wanted to be the person who stopped the line over something that might be nothing. The culture of speed had trained them well. Keep moving. Don't question. Trust that someone else would handle it if it mattered. The warning he had left behind became background noise, drowned out by the urgency of production and the confidence that had replaced caution. The moment he walked out the door, he felt it before he saw it, a sudden vibration through the steering wheel as his phone buzzed against the seat beside him, an unknown number flashing across the screen, and though he didn't answer it immediately, his chest tightened with recognition, because part of him had been waiting for this moment since he left the parking lot. He let the call go to voicemail, pulled into a gas station, and sat there with the engine idling, listening to the message play back through the truck's speakers. The voice on the other end was rushed, strained, stripped of authority by panic, words tumbling over each other as they described alarms sounding, a conveyor seizing, a smell of burning metal spreading through the bay. They didn't say his name, not at first, but they didn't have to. He already knew which machine it was. For a long moment, he sat there in silence, the weight of choice settling over him like a physical thing. He had been fired. He owed them nothing. He could turn off his phone and drive home, let the consequences fall where they may, let management explain why warnings were ignored. But then he thought about the operators on that line, people he had worked alongside for years, people who trusted the machines because they trusted the system, and he knew that walking away now would mean accepting an outcome he could still prevent. The warning no one heard was about to make itself known in the loudest way possible, and as he started the engine and turned back toward the factory, the irony was not lost on him. They had fired him for being too slow, and now, with every minute that passed, time itself was becoming their greatest enemy. Chaos didn't announce itself with a single catastrophic failure. It crept in piece by piece, disguised at first as minor disruption, the kind factories learned to absorb without panic, until suddenly there was no room left to pretend things were under control. Inside the plant, alarms began chirping intermittently, not the piercing sirens reserved for emergencies, but warning tones operators had been conditioned to acknowledge and override. And as the conveyor stuttered, belts jerking instead of gliding, supervisors shouted for adjustments rather than shutdowns. The heat around the housing surged, metal expanding against metal, friction climbing with every rotation, and the grinding sound he had warned about grew louder, harsher, vibrating through the floor in a way even the most inexperienced worker could feel through their boots. Operators hesitated, hands hovering near emergency stops, eyes darting between flashing indicators and supervisors, urging them to keep the line moving just a little longer, just until the current batch cleared. Someone yelled that smoke was coming from beneath the housing, thin at first, barely visible against the haze that always hung in the air, but sharp enough to sting eyes and throats, and panic rippled outward as workers realized this wasn't a glitch they could ride out. The belt seized suddenly, torque building faster than the system could release it, and a loud crack echoed across the floor, metal fracturing where stress had finally won. Production screeched to a halt as the conveyor locked, motors whining under load, sparks bursting where insulation failed, and the smell of burning oil filled the bay. Supervisors scrambled, radios crackling as they called for maintenance crews already stretched thin, people running toward the problem without fully understanding what they were running into, because the one person who knew exactly what had gone wrong was no longer on the floor. Emergency stops were hit in rapid succession, plunging sections of the plant into sudden silence broken only by alarms and shouted instructions, and as smoke thickened, the risk escalated from lost production to potential injury. Workers backed away instinctively, some covering their faces, others frozen by uncertainty, because a conveyor failure under that kind of stress could tear itself apart violently if pressure wasn't relieved correctly. Management watched from the control room, eyes wide as data spiked and dropped across monitors, numbers no longer translating cleanly into solutions, and the plant manager's earlier confidence evaporated under the realization that they were staring down a scenario their protocols didn't cover neatly. Fire suppression systems loomed as a last resort, measures that would shut down entire sections of the factory and cost millions. And even then, no one could guarantee the failure wouldn't cascade into adjacent systems. Someone finally shouted the question. No one wanted to ask, does anyone know what's actually wrong with it? And the silence that followed was damning, because the answer had walked out the door hours earlier, carrying a lunch pail and a warning no one read. As the chaos unfolded, his truck pulled back into the parking lot, tires crunching against gravel as he stepped out into a scene that looked nothing like the orderly floor he had left behind. Smoke drifted from vents, alarms echoed faintly through walls, and the urgency in the air was unmistakable. He moved quickly now, not rushed, but purposeful, instinct sharp, because he knew exactly what he was walking into. A supervisor spotted him, crossing the lot, and froze, disbelief flickering across their face before relief took its place, and though pride screamed to stop him, to turn him away, survival overruled ego in that moment. They met him halfway, voices raised over the noise, words tumbling out in fragments. The conveyor, it locked up, alarms everywhere, we don't know. He didn't wait for the explanation to finish. He already knew. He grabbed a hard hat from a rack, pulled on gloves, and headed straight for the affected bay, mind racing through the steps required to stabilize the system before it tore itself apart completely. Inside, workers parted instinctively as he approached, recognition spreading quickly, and though no one said it aloud yet, the truth was written on every face. The man they'd fired for being too slow was now the only one who could move fast enough, smart enough to stop a bad situation from becoming a disaster. The call they never wanted to make came in fragments, rushed voices layered with static and urgency, and even before the words fully formed, he understood the weight behind them, the quiet admission that the system they trusted had failed without him. The plant manager's voice cracked as they spoke, authority stripped away by necessity, explaining in clipped sentences that the conveyor had seized, that smoke was spreading, that production was down, and people were backing away in fear. And though they never said the words out loud, the apology hung in the silence between them, heavy and unavoidable. He listened without interruption, gripping the steering wheel as the factory loomed closer in his windshield, and when the voice on the other end asked if he could come back, if he could help, he did not answer immediately, because the request carried more than urgency, it carried reckoning. In that brief pause, years of dismissal replayed in his mind, the meetings where his concerns were brushed aside, the jokes about his pace, the final conversation that ended his job, and for a split second, he considered the option he had every right to take, turning around, letting them face the consequences of their choices. But then he thought about the people still inside that building, operators he had trained, co-workers who trusted the machines because they trusted the system, and he knew that whatever anger he felt could not outweigh the responsibility he carried toward their safety. "I'm already on my way," he said finally, voice steady, and the relief on the other end was immediate, almost overwhelming, because survival had a way of humbling pride faster than any lecture ever could. When he arrived, the factory floor was a study in controlled panic. Alarms echoing off steel walls, supervisors shouting over the din, workers clustered at safe distances, unsure of what to do next. And as he stepped inside, eyes turned toward him with a mixture of hope and disbelief. No one questioned his presence now. No one mentioned his termination. In that moment, titles and decisions made hours earlier meant nothing compared to the immediate need to stop the system from destroying itself. He moved through the chaos with focused calm, issuing clear instructions, directing people to shut down adjacent systems, to clear space, to open access panels. He knew better than anyone else, and as he worked, the factory responded. Noise shifting from frantic to controlled, panic giving way to action. Supervisors followed his lead without hesitation, taking orders from the very man they had dismissed, and the irony was not lost on anyone watching. He assessed the damage. Quickly, confirming what he had already known, the housing had warped under heat, internal components grinding themselves toward failure, and if pressure wasn't relieved in the correct sequence, the release could be violent. He barked out commands with precision, timing shutdowns, bleeding off pressure, preventing secondary failures from cascading through the line, and every step he took was informed by the time he had once been criticized for taking too long. As the system stabilized, alarms silenced one by one, smoke thinning as ventilation kicked in, the immediate danger began to pass, and the realization spread through the floor that disaster had been averted by someone they had labeled expendable. The call they never wanted to make had been answered not with resentment, but with expertise. And as the plant manager watched him work, face pale under fluorescent lights, they understood fully now that speed without understanding had nearly cost them everything. Walking back into the fire felt strangely familiar to him, not because he had expected this moment, but because crisis had a way of stripping everything down to what truly mattered, and what mattered now was stopping a bad situation from turning deadly. The heat inside the bay pressed against his face as he moved closer to the damaged conveyor, sweat forming under his collar despite the ventilation screaming overhead, and he shut out everything except the machine in front of him, the groan of stressed metal, the whine of motors fighting resistance they were never meant to face. Supervisors hovered nearby, eyes wide, waiting for direction, and without hesitation he assigned tasks, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the noise with authority, earned not from title, but from understanding. He had spent years learning how systems failed, under pressure, and now that knowledge guided every step he took, every instruction he gave. He dropped to one knee, beside the housing, gloved hands feeling for vibration through the steel, listening with his body as much as his ears, confirming what the gauges could only hint at. The warped casing had shifted internal rollers just enough to cause uneven load distribution, forcing one side to carry more weight than it was designed for, and the longer it ran, the closer it came to catastrophic release. He ordered power reduced in stages, not cut abruptly, knowing that a sudden stop could shear components and send debris flying. And as operators followed his instructions precisely, the angry scream of the system softened into a strained hum. Every second mattered now, and yet this was exactly the kind of moment he had always prepared for. The reason he refused to rush inspections, because when things went wrong, there was no time to guess. Tension hung thick as the system slowed, metal cooling gradually, pressure bleeding off safely, and he moved quickly but deliberately, loosening fasteners in a specific sequence, bracing parts that would otherwise snap free under residual force. Someone nearby muttered that they'd never seen anyone work like this under pressure, and he didn't respond because focus left no room for commentary. He replaced a temporary support with a reinforced brace, one he had fabricated months earlier for a different repair and kept in storage because he believed in being prepared for failures no one else planned for. That decision alone prevented the housing from collapsing inward as it cooled, averting a chain reaction that could have torn the conveyor apart. As the danger receded, the frantic energy on the floor shifted, alarms falling silent, workers edging closer as fear gave way to awe, and supervisors watched in stunned quiet as he finished securing the final components. He stepped back at last, wiping sweat from his brow, scanning the system with a practiced eye, ensuring stability before allowing anyone to breathe easier. And when he finally nodded, signaling that the immediate threat had passed, a collective exhale rippled through the bay. The factory, moments from disaster, stood intact, and the man they had fired hours earlier stood at the center of it, having walked straight back into the fire, not out of obligation or pride, but because he knew what happened when no one took the time to do things right. The fix that saved everyone was not a single dramatic action, but a series of precise decisions made under pressure, each one rooted in knowledge he had earned the hard way and been criticized for taking too seriously. With the immediate danger contained, he moved deeper into the system, opening access panels others rarely touched, tracing the path of stress back to its source rather than stopping at the most visible damage. Inside, the warped housing, internal rollers had worn unevenly, their bearings compromised by heat and misalignment, creating resistance that multiplied with every rotation. And he recognized instantly that simply replacing a broken part would not be enough. The entire load path needed to be corrected, or the same failure would repeat itself the moment production resumed. He directed the maintenance crew to bring specific tools and replacement components, calling them out by size and rating without hesitation, and the speed with which he did so startled the supervisors watching, because this was the same man they had labeled slow. In reality, his efficiency came from preparation, from years spent memorizing systems others treated as interchangeable. And now that preparation paid off. He realigned the rollers by fractions of an inch, recalibrated tension across the belt, and adjusted the motor coupling to account for thermal expansion, changes subtle enough to be invisible to the untrained eye, but critical to the system's integrity. Each adjustment reduced strain, lowering temperature and vibration until the machine began to behave the way it was always meant to. As he worked, he explained what he was doing, not out of obligation, but because he believed knowledge should be shared, even in moments like this. And operators leaned in, listening intently, realizing for the first time why his inspections took longer, why he refused to rush steps that seemed insignificant. He showed them the thinning metal, the microfractures that would have become fractures under full load, the evidence that the failure had been building for weeks, not minutes. And the room fell quiet as understanding replaced disbelief. This wasn't bad luck or an unpredictable malfunction. It was a consequence, narrowly avoided. When the system was finally ready to be tested, he insisted on a controlled restart, gradually increasing speed while monitoring temperature and vibration, eyes and hands, moving constantly, alert to any sign of renewed stress. The conveyor came back to life smoothly, belts gliding instead of jerking, the grinding noise gone, replaced by the steady hum it should have had all along. People watched in silence as the numbers stabilized on monitors, alarms stayed dark, and the factory breathed again, saved not by haste or improvisation, but by patience applied at exactly the right moment. As he shut down his tools and stepped back, exhaustion settling into his muscles, the weight of what had nearly happened became clear to everyone present. The fix had not just prevented downtime or financial loss, it had prevented injuries, maybe worse, and the realization hung heavy in the air. The man they had fired for being too slow had just demonstrated beyond argument that taking the time to understand the system was the fastest way to save it when everything was on the line. When the smoke cleared and the machines settled back into their familiar rhythm, the factory fell into a strange, reflective quiet, the kind that followed narrowly avoided disaster, where everyone understood something significant had happened, but no one was quite ready to say it out loud. Supervisors stood off to the side, clipboards forgotten, faces pale as they replayed the sequence of events in their minds, recognizing how close they had come to catastrophic failure. The charts and metrics that had justified his dismissal only hours earlier now felt hollow, incapable of capturing the cost of what almost went wrong or the value of the expertise they had nearly discarded. Workers gathered in small clusters, voices low, exchanging looks that carried a mixture of relief and disbelief, because many of them had trusted the machines implicitly, believing that if something truly dangerous existed, someone higher up would have addressed it already. Now they understood how fragile that trust could be, how quickly efficiency could turn into risk when warnings were ignored. Some of them sought him out, offering quiet thanks, nods of respect that felt heavier than applause, and he accepted them with the same calm humility he brought to every job, because to him, preventing disaster was simply part of the responsibility he had always carried. Management, on the other hand, struggled to find footing in the aftermath. The plant manager paced near the control room, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the stabilized system, as if expecting it to fail again out of spite. And when they finally approached him, the words came out awkwardly, stripped of the authority that had ended his job earlier that day. There were apologies, hesitant and incomplete, acknowledgments that mistakes had been made, that warnings should have been taken seriously, and though none of it could erase what had happened, the shift in tone was unmistakable. The silence after their words felt heavier than any reprimand, because it was filled with the understanding that competence had been mistaken for inefficiency and caution for weakness. He listened without interruption, just as he had in the meeting that fired him, and when they finished, he responded simply, not with anger or vindication, but with clarity. He spoke about the importance of listening to the floor, of valuing prevention as much as output, of understanding that safety was not an obstacle to productivity, but its foundation. His words carried weight now, not because they were louder or more forceful, but because everyone present had just witnessed the consequences of ignoring them. As the factory resumed operation under stricter monitoring, the reality of what had been avoided settled in fully. Reports were filed, inspections ordered, and policies revisited. But the most significant change was less tangible, a shift in perception that could not be mandated from above. People began to look at the machines differently, to question sounds and vibrations they once dismissed, to appreciate the difference between moving fast and moving smart. And at the center of it all stood a man who had been labeled expendable, now holding undeniable proof that his approach had not just saved the factory's production line, but had safeguarded the lives of everyone who worked there, leaving behind a silence not of shame, but of hard-earned recognition. When patience finally revealed its power, it did so without ceremony, without a press release or applause, just in the quiet understanding that settled over the factory in the hours after everything had been saved. The mechanic stood near the edge of the floor, wiping his hands clean, listening to the machines he had just stabilized. And for the first time that day, He allowed himself to feel the exhaustion in his body, the kind that came not from being overworked, but from carrying responsibility that no one else wanted until it became unavoidable. He looked around at the people returning to their stations, moving with a little more care now, a little more awareness, and he knew that something fundamental had shifted, not because he had proven himself right, but because the cost of ignoring him had almost been catastrophic. Management approached him again later, this time without hesitation, without defensiveness, and the conversation that followed was different from any he had had in that office before. They spoke openly about reinstatement, about restructuring maintenance protocols, about giving his role the authority it should have had all along. And while the words sounded sincere, he understood that what mattered most was not the offer itself, but whether the culture behind it would truly change. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he spoke about the younger mechanics on the floor, about training that emphasized understanding over speed, about building systems that rewarded people for preventing problems rather than reacting to them. He made it clear that he would not return simply to fill a position. He would return only if his approach was respected, because saving the factory once did not mean he would allow the same mistakes to repeat themselves. The workers watched these conversations unfold with quiet interest, because his story had become more than a personal redemption. It had become a lesson written into the walls of the plant itself. They saw how quickly someone could be dismissed when they didn't fit a narrow definition of productivity, and how just as quickly that definition could crumble when reality intervened. In the days that followed, his warning about the conveyor became a point of reference, a reminder shared during briefings and training sessions, an example of why slowing down in the right moments could mean everything. For him, the experience reshaped how he saw his own value, not in the sense of validation, but in clarity. He understood now that patience was not passive. It was active, intentional, and powerful when applied with knowledge and integrity. Being labeled too slow had never been a flaw. It had been a misunderstanding born of a system that confused motion with progress, and the events of that day had exposed that confusion in the starkest way possible. As he walked out of the factory that evening, not fired this time but respected, he felt a quiet resolve settle in, the certainty that his approach mattered, that his voice deserved space, and that sometimes the people who move the slowest are the ones who keep everything from falling apart. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you that patience, skill, and quiet diligence still matter in a world obsessed with speed, then make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel, because these are the stories that deserve to be heard, the ones that show how real change often begins with someone who refuses to rush, even when the world tells them they should. When the story finally settled into memory, it did so not as a tale of revenge or triumph, but as a lesson written quietly into the bones of everyone who witnessed it, a reminder that systems often mistake urgency for wisdom and speed for competence until reality intervenes without mercy. The mechanic did not become a hero in the way stories usually demand. There were no standing ovations or headlines, just a recalibration of respect that had been long overdue, and that was enough for him, because his purpose had never been recognition. It had always been prevention. The factory continued to run in the weeks that followed, but it ran differently now. Inspections were deeper, conversations slower, decisions less reactive, and the phrase "too slow" lost its sting as people began to understand what it had really meant all along. He returned to work on his own terms, training younger mechanics not just how to fix machines, but how to listen to them, how to read the signs before alarms ever sounded, and how to carry responsibility even when no one was watching. Management learned painfully that efficiency without understanding was a gamble they could no longer afford. And workers learned that patience was not weakness, it was protection. In the end, the factory wasn't saved by lack or force. It was saved by someone who refused to rush, when rushing would have been easier. Someone who understood that doing things right often looks slow, until the moment everything depends on it. And if this story made you think differently about the people who work quietly behind the scenes, the ones whose value only becomes visible when disaster is narrowly avoided, then take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Because these are the stories that remind us that real strength often moves at its own pace, steady, deliberate, and impossible to replace once it's gone.